Hello, good afternoon, welcome. I'm Francesca D'Alessio, the Associate Educator for Public Programs here at the Met, and I'm so delighted to welcome you here today. Thank you so much for coming on this Sunday. Yay! We have an opportunity here through our talks at the Met to take a closer look at exhibitions and the permanent collection, and to explore themes and create new connections with a variety of museum experts. Today is the second in our series of 3, titled Making History. To explore the evolution of history painting, today we will discover an 18th century revolution in history painting as artists shifted focus to contemporary events in response to rapid political and social change. We hope you will join us again for the series finale on June 28th. Same time, same place, 2 o'clock right here on June 28th. Before I tell you a bit more about our amazing speaker, I'd just like to thank my amazing colleagues in education, Mariana Siciliano and Isaac Poole, for all of their incredible support. Kathryn Calley Galitz is an art historian and educator here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She's also such an amazing colleague and friend to so many of us. She's received her PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts in New York University. Kathy is a frequent lecturer and has taught at both New York University, Hunter College, and was a fellow at the Art Institute of Chicago. At the Met, she's served on the curatorial team for international exhibitions and has published numerous works on neoclassical portraiture. She is also the author of Metropolitan Museum of Art Masterpieces in 2016, How to Read Portraits from 2024, and most recently, Manet, The Great Works from 2026. Kathy is highly distinguished here at the Met, and it is such an honor to learn from her. Her esteemed scholarship and publications are absolutely unparalleled. It is such a great honor and pleasure for me to introduce to you Kathy Calley Galitz.
Oh my gosh, I think I'm blushing. Thank you, Fran. That was really generous. And I want to thank all of you for coming out today, too. First of all, it is such a beautiful day. And second of all, I'm pretty much sure that I'm the only person who woke up this morning thinking about history painting. So thank you for coming to a talk on history painting. And then maybe right after history painting, I was thinking about the Knicks Spurs, but that's another story. So anyway, on a more serious note, too, as I was working on this lecture and thinking about history painting, it just struck me how relevant and resonant so many of the paintings that I'll be showing you today, which really span the mid-18th century to sort of 1960, and how sadly relevant that they are today, but also how extremely powerful the artistic responses that we'll be looking at, how powerful those works are, and there's a kind of timelessness and a universality in these works that really do, to my mind, and I know I'm a little bit biased because I'm really interested in this subject, but I really feel that history painting is very much something we should all be thinking about today, and it has lessons to teach us all. So, on that note, we'll jump in. When last we met, the exalted tradition of history painting, scenes from the Bible, mythology, and the distant past, was having an identity crisis. Oh yeah, and in case you weren't here last month rather, you can go on the Met's YouTube site and see my first lecture to learn more about that identity crisis. So done with the plug. Emanuel Leutz's monumental homage to General George Washington's heroic crossing of the Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776, was not well received when it was exhibited, was not well received by New York audiences when it was exhibited in 1864 during the Civil War. Intended as a patriotic rallying cry and painted in 1851 at a time of democratic uprisings in Europe, Leutz's work and its attendant moral lesson were dismissed by critics as, quote, cheap, showy learning. So New York crowd is long time history being a tough crowd for artists. The 19th century had witnessed the rising popularity of history painting that favored sentimental narrative over didacticism, as embodied in the work of the French artist Paul Delaroche, whose melodramatic painting of the final moments of the 16th century English queen, Lady Jane Grey, was a sensation at the Paris Salon of 1834. And in fact, the work now resides at the National Gallery in London, and it is, to this day, one of their most popular paintings. And on that note, because you know I have to go here, the actress Rachel Zegler recently went viral when she channeled Lady Jane Grey for the Met Gala. I don't know if she realized she was portraying someone who was about to lose her head, but that's another story. Not my problem. Although the past continued to lure artists throughout the 19th century, among them the members of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in Victorian England, as seen here, a radical new vision of history painting had emerged in the final decades of the 18th century, when contemporary events came to the fore. Today, we will focus on the moments that compelled artists to paint history as it was happening, from revolution and war to political assassinations. Artistic developments in 18th century Britain set the stage for this revolution in history painting. And we did talk a little bit about this work in my first talk. The American-born artist Benjamin West depicted the death of the British General Wolfe on the field of battle in Quebec in 1759. And he painted this work in his London studio in 1770, so almost contemporary. West's idealized representation of the event, which was neither as heroic nor as dramatic as it here appears, aligns with the grand style of history painting as espoused by London's Royal Academy of Arts, in particular its then president, Sir Joshua Reynolds. And Reynolds was not happy with West's choice to paint the scene as it appears here. West's choice to depict his hero in contemporary dress, quote, breeches and cocked hat, is at odds with the timeless classicizing language of history painting that was promoted as the Academy's ideal. Around the same time, contemporary events also informed the work of West's fellow American in London, John Singleton Copley. In 1781, during the American War of Independence, French troops invaded Jersey, one of the Channel Islands, which was then under British rule. The British commander, Major Francis Pearson, lost his life while mounting a counterattack that resulted in a British victory. And this was by no means a major battle. An enterprising print publisher by the name of John Boydell seized on the patriotic fervor inspired by this minor battle and immediately commissioned a painting of it from Copley, which was exhibited 3 years after Pearson's heroic death. And the reason why he would want the painting is he then owned the rights to it, and then he could reproduce it in prints and make a lot of money, which is what happened. On a canvas stretching some 8 by 12 feet, Pearson, mortally wounded, occupies center stage. And you can conveniently pick out Pearson because he's the person dying beneath the gigantic Union Jack. Oh, and he's expiring in the arms of fellow soldiers. And then meanwhile, just to the left of all that, you see an unidentified black soldier who aims his rifles at the retreating French soldiers in the background. This dramatic act of vengeance is not corroborated by any official record, despite Copley's claim, and I quote the brochure that accompanied this exhibition, quote, "Picture is founded on facts, and facts are spelled in all caps." Sound familiar? Oops. Copley's artistic license, like that of West before him, reinforced the work's propagandistic function, glorifying Pearson's heroism and, by extension, playing to British patriotic sentiments when that nation was at war with France. So, anything that could make them look good against the French, they were all down for. But meanwhile, this is happening in England, 1783. History painting across the Channel in France at the same time looked like this. In 1785, just 1 year after Copley exhibited The Death of Major Pearson in London, Jacques-Louis David glorified an extreme example of patriotism in ancient Rome as the Horatii brothers pledged their loyalty to the Roman Republic over the bonds of family. And this was one really dysfunctional family, because this story does not end well. The three brothers go off to fight the enemy brothers as they swear to their father that they will do. But meanwhile, one of their sisters was engaged to one of the enemy brothers, and so she ended up getting killed by her own brother because she was mourning the death of her fiancé. So that's what I mean, dysfunctional family. However, David's innovative approach to the Oath of the Horatii established him as the leading history painter in France. 4 years later, David revisited the conflict between familial and civic duty in his depiction of Brutus, the founder of the Roman Republic, and another unlucky father, who was forced to condemn his sons to death for conspiring against the Republic. And you can see in the background in the left the bodies of his sons being brought in. And we see Brutus, their father, seated next to a statue representing Rome. And notice how David shrouds the figure of Brutus in darkness while the women in the family are shown in greater light. And Brutus is clutching the letter that reveals his son's treachery, and only his writhing feet. Just look at the way David paints his feet. They're clenched up in tension and anxiety. That's the only sign that betrays his anguish as a father, because Brutus was forced to choose duty to the state over duty to his family. Despite the radical nature of David's pared-down composition and his mastery of the new neoclassical style, his subjects remained grounded in the classical tradition of history painting as propagated by European art academies. 6 weeks before David's painting of Brutus was exhibited at the Paris Salon of 1789, an insurrectionary mob of some 800 people stormed the Bastille prison in a revolt against royal authority, marking the onset of the French Revolution on July 14, 1789. And that's a recreation of said event. David's painting would be appropriated as an icon of revolutionary propaganda. In fact, a tableau vivant of the work was staged by actors in the revival of Voltaire's 1730 tragedy, Brutus, which at this time was newly topical and was performed 15 times during the 1790-91 theater season in Paris. According to a contemporary account of one of the performances, quote, "Every Parisian knew David's painting. It was like a national holiday, heightened by unanimous applause." So in other words, when people saw the actors recreating the painting, they knew exactly the source. The events of 1789 rapidly propelled David's art from ancient Rome to the present. On June 20, 1789, over 600 representatives of the Third Estate met at the tennis court on the grounds of the royal residence at Versailles, having just formed the National Assembly. And also, they met at the tennis court because they got locked out of where they were supposed to meet. And just to put the Third Estate in today's terms, they would be like, in today's terms, the 98%. That's the Third Estate. There, in this tennis court, which, by the way, you can still visit today on the grounds of Versailles, they collectively swore an oath to unite until a constitution was established. In choosing to represent this event, David redefined the purview of history painting in France. These men are not ancient Romans in togas swearing an oath. They are David's contemporaries. It is as much a group portrait as a history painting, as the principal actors in this scene can be identified. And in addition to this drawing of the composition made in 1791, David executed hundreds of studies of individual figures, because this is, of course, that David has had his sight set on more than just a drawing of the event, as he proclaimed in 1792 in rather pompous terms. As he wrote to the President of the National Assembly, quote, "We will no longer have to try to find subjects for our painting in the history of ancient peoples. No history of any people offers me anything as great or as sublime as the oath of the tennis court, which I must paint." He goes on to say, "French nation, I wish to propagate your glory. People of the universe, present and future, I wish to teach you this great lesson." So, I mean, that gives you a sense of A, how he saw himself, and B, how he saw the role of his history painting. Unfortunately, though, history itself had other plans for David's first contemporary history painting, a victim of the period's tumultuous politics. David's painting became outdated before he could finish it. Its heroes fell from grace as the events of the revolution unfolded in the 1790s, perhaps none more spectacularly than Robespierre, the architect of the bloody Reign of Terror. And here's Robespierre. And guess what happened to him? And thank you, Todd, for those great graphics. I gotta give my husband credit for this one. I was just gonna get an arrow, and I thought an arrow would have sufficed, but I think this is even better. By 1803, David had abandoned the canvas, leaving only this large fragment of a work that would have, in its finished state, measured some 36 by 22 feet, its scale attesting to David's outsized ambitions for this subject. During the revolutionary decade of the 1790s, David's art became inextricably linked with contemporary history. More than representing events, his art shaped the historical narrative as it was unfolding. And today you can still see this fragment of a canvas at Versailles, but sidebar, it was a real treat to see this at the David show in Paris last fall, because it rarely, if ever, leaves Versailles, and it was also down low, and you could get really close and see these different figures, and also get a taste of David's working method. I mean, he draws these figures nude, then he clothes them, well, had he gotten around to it, but interestingly, to see whose portraits he actually resolved before abandoning the canvas. But back to the 1790s. On July 13, 1793, the journalist and radical revolutionary Jean-Paul Marat was murdered in his bath by Charlotte Corday. This was a political assassination. Marat was an extremist who advocated violence and bloodshed. And it's a bit of an irony, since he published a radical journal and he was known as the friend of the people, but believe me, he was no friend of many people, because he was calling for a lot of people to be killed in order to advance the radical aims of the revolution. And he was also a close friend of David. The day after his murder, the revolutionary government asked David to commemorate Marat in a painting. 3 months later, at the artist's request, this painting was displayed in a courtyard in the Louvre, just hours after the former Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, had been guillotined, and she was one of the tens of thousands of victims of the Reign of Terror, as this violent phase of the revolution was known. And oh, by the way, it was also orchestrated by Robespierre, who would ultimately become a victim of his own violence. And just to make the comparison of how does David show Marat, and look at how he captured Marie Antoinette, the last representative of the Ancien Regime, toothless and wigless, on her way to the scaffolds, as captured by David with brutal candor. out with the old and in with the new. The new Republic of France needed new heroes to propagate its cause. In its early years, Marat and others who sacrificed their lives for the ongoing revolution were seen as martyrs. David, who had also staged his friend Marat's funeral, commemorated Marat accordingly, mythologizing his subject in both word and image. I mean, the idea of propaganda was really used to great effect during the revolution by David and his contemporaries, staging funerals, promoting their own vision of history to great, and it was extremely, extremely powerful. To give you an idea of how David was so conscious of messaging, he was one of the last people who had seen Marat alive, having visited him the day before his murder. And he claimed to have seen Marat similarly posed. And here are David's words, quote, "Near him he had a block of wood on which ink and paper were placed, and with his hand emerging from the bathtub, he was writing his final thoughts for the good of the people." So again, propagating this image as Marat, as this great man of charity and supporter of the people. And in fact, that was the ploy that Charlotte Corday had used to gain access to Marat. She was going to claim that there was a widow and her children who had been orphaned by someone who had died for the revolutionary cause, and therefore this family needed Marat's help. And that piece of paper that you see just hanging over the edge of his writing block was supposedly the note that Marat had written in order to aid this non-existent widow and her children. David titled his painting Marat at his last breath. Many people call it today The Death of Marat, but that was not its original title. And indeed, Marat is still seen as alive as David painted him. He's still holding his quill pen in one hand, the bottom hand, and in the other, the treacherous note that Corday had used to gain access. His body and features are idealized. All traces of the debilitating skin condition from which he suffered are effaced. And in fact, that's why he was in this bath. It was a medicinal bath intended to help ease his suffering. This is no portrait likeness. His pose recalls images of the entombment of Christ, linking Marat's sacrifice with that of Christ. The illusion was not lost on the poet and writer Charles Baudelaire, who invoked the divine Marat and his sacrilegious wound when he saw the painting in 1846. This is the language of history painting, not portraiture. To that point, David himself referred to this work and his other depictions of revolutionary martyrs as history paintings, not portraits. David's Marat was deployed as revolutionary propaganda, shaping the ongoing narrative of contemporary events. A month after it was painted, the government ordered 1,000 prints to be disseminated throughout France, and the painting itself hung in the legislative chamber, paired with David's painting of another revolutionary martyr, Michel Le Pelletier de Saint-Fargeau, known today only by this fragmentary engraving. The original painting of the work on the right was destroyed in the 19th century, probably at the request of the subject's daughter. So that gives you an idea how politically charged, and not in a good way, these works became as politics in France changed so rapidly. Within a year, 2 copies of The Death of Marat were realized in David's studio. And again, in the Paris exhibition last fall, all 3 of these works were assembled together as the centerpiece of this exhibition, dramatically lit. It was really, really powerful. And in the center, on the left, you see the original, followed by the 2 copies by some of David's best students, including François Gérard. David's Marat served as a potent symbol of sacrifice for the revolutionary cause, bringing unprecedented immediacy and intensity to the didactic function of history painting. The 1790s brought a succession of regime changes in France. Near the end of this tumultuous decade, David first encountered the man who would change the course of history and history painting. At David's invitation, General Napoleon Bonaparte sat for his portrait in around 1797, resulting in this unfinished work. And you can see, again, it has the spontaneity of having been painted from life. And of course, notice how David pays greatest attention to Bonaparte's features. After this sitting, a star-struck David proclaimed to his curious students, who of course wanted to know what the whole experience was like, David said, and I quote, "Bonaparte is my hero." As for David's subject, Bonaparte was quick to marshal history painting in the service of a vast propaganda machine to glorify his meteoric rise and legitimize his power, because about 2 years after David captured this likeness, Bonaparte seized power in a coup d'etat in 1799. David was one of the first artists to rise to the challenge of representing Bonaparte, realizing this monumental portrait of General Bonaparte crossing the Alps. This episode set the stage for the French victory over the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo in June 1800 that consolidated Bonaparte's authority as first consul in France. It is as much a history painting as a portrait, grandly aligning Bonaparte with the great military commanders of the past who had preceded him in their Alpine crossings, notably Hannibal and Charlemagne. And in case you forgot about that, their names are conveniently inscribed in the rocks below Bonaparte and his horse. Bonaparte did not model for this work because, of course, he was too busy to sit for a portraitist. However, you can see David probably making use of that study from life that he had already done. Here, not only did he not model for the work, I forgot the most important detail. At Bonaparte's request, he appears, quote, calm on a fiery steed, when, in fact, he crossed the Alps on a mule a couple of days after his troops had paved the way for him. But of course, trudging across the Alps on a mule does not have the same grandeur as being seated on a rearing horse painted larger than life. Here, the didactic function of history painting has been usurped by that of political propaganda. And again, I can't help here but think of Copley and his claim for facts in all capital letters. And here's a representation of history that is totally departing from FACTS, facts. The portrait was commissioned by the King of Spain, Charles IV, again in an effort, no doubt, to curry favor with Bonaparte. But Bonaparte himself ordered 3 additional copies for public display, again attesting to the work's propagandistic value. 4 years later, General Bonaparte became Napoleon I, the self-proclaimed emperor of France. But by 1807, things were not going so well for Napoleon I or General Bonaparte. In the face of declining public support for Napoleon's ongoing military campaigns, the French government launched a propaganda campaign following the tens of thousands killed at the Battle of Eylau in rural Poland in winter 1807, which, although a victory, was a very costly one for the French. And if any of you saw that really bad Napoleon movie a couple of years ago with Joaquin Phoenix, I think this was the battle that, who was the director? Ridley Scott? I forget. Anyway, I think this was the battle that they were trying to recreate. Another aside, sorry. I had high hopes for that movie, but it disappointed. David's student, Antoine Jean Gros, was the winner of a public competition that called for artists to represent, quote, the moment when the emperor, visiting the battlefield, comes to bring help and consolation to the victims of the fighting. And the call for paintings further stipulated, quote, that the work should instill in princes a love of peace and a horror of war. And of course, you can't miss Bonaparte, right? He's there on that light-colored horse, looking heroic. Because in fact, what Gros's work really does is glorify Napoleon, highlighting his Christ-like gesture of clemency as a wounded Lithuanian kneels at his feet amidst the frozen corpses and pools of blood in the barren winter landscape. This Lithuanian, though, as the artist himself put it, enthusiastically expresses his gratitude to Napoleon, is a complete fiction. So again, so much for historical fact. This was not the first time that Gros portrayed Bonaparte as a Christ-like figure. During his Egyptian campaign in 1799, Bonaparte visited French soldiers stricken by the bubonic plague. In point of fact, yeah, he visited them, but he also left them there to die and went back to France. And it was a huge scandal in the press in both France and in England. And he was lambasted by caricaturists in England for the horrors at Jaffa. But in Gros's version, painted in 1804 as propaganda, Bonaparte appeals to have the healing touch of Christ. In 1808, Napoleon's army invaded Spain. The artist Francisco de Goya, who was then 60 years old and living in Madrid, became a first-hand witness to history. From 1810 to 1820, Goya realized the disasters of war, a series of 80 prints that represent his real-time response to the Peninsular War, which devastated Spain from 1808 to 1814. Because of their political content, these works were not published until 1863, 35 years after the artist's death. With unsparing candor and unprecedented immediacy, Goya captured the horrors of war and man's inhumanity in works based on his lived experience. To that point, the engraving of villagers fleeing from armed conflict that you see on the right bears the artist's inscription, "I saw it." And those three words are often quoted in relation to Goya, not only for his Disasters of War series, but the works that we're about to talk about. The other engraving on the left, Goya titled "Rightly or Wrongly," and it expresses the senseless brutality of war. The Disasters of War is widely understood as Goya's condemnation of war and violence. Goya returned to the subject of war in 1814 with a pair of canvases that redefined the terrain of history painting. Both this painting and its pendant were royal commissions in 1814, when the Spanish monarchy was restored following the defeat of Napoleon in the Peninsular War. This work commemorates the popular uprising against the French occupying forces that took place in Madrid on May 2nd, 1808, and this event marked the beginning of the Spanish resistance. Departing from the narrative clarity traditionally associated with history painting, Goya's composition lacks a focal point. The scene captures the frenzied atmosphere of the street fight waged by the Spaniard, outnumbered and ill-equipped for battle against Napoleon's elite troops. As one witness to this day recalled, quote, "Only enraged civilians could be seen in the street. Gangs began forming so ridiculously armed that it was foolish to believe that they could take on French soldiers." And above all, Goya depicts a battle without an individual hero. Goya's modern vision of war radically departs from the staged battle scenes that were painted by Gros and other artists in the service of Napoleonic propaganda on the other side of the Pyrenees, right? You know, there's no single person getting glorified. You just see on the left with Goya the horrors, the atrocities, the violence of essentially hand-to-hand combat on the streets of Madrid. Goya also recorded the aftermath of this popular uprising on a second canvas made in 1814. Later that day and into the night, French soldiers staged large-scale executions in and around Madrid. Goya is said to have viewed those at the hill of Principe Pio from the window of his room with the aid of a telescope. As the artist Gardner recalled, Goya, armed with a gun and his portfolio, went to the site of the executions after midnight and, working in the moonlight, drew the scene of carnage. When asked why he drew, quote, "these barbarities which men commit," Goya replied, "to warn men not to be barbarians ever again." 6 years later, Goya realized this painting of the events of May 3rd, 1808, in which faceless French soldiers carry out mass executions of the Spanish rebels in the cover of darkness, lit only by an oil lamp. Its close-up viewpoint gives the work an intimacy and immediacy that enhances its expressive power, as we ourselves become witnesses to the execution. The corpses at left seemingly extend into our space. The 3rd of May has resonated with generations of artists. The French painter Edouard Manet first encountered Goya's painting in his 1865 visit to the Prado Museum in Madrid. At the time, Manet was more taken by Velázquez's works, but soon Goya. 2 years later, in April 1867, the first engraving of this work was published in a monograph on Goya, and Manet knew the author of that monograph. That June, the Habsburg Archduke Maximilian I, Emperor of Mexico, was assassinated by a firing squad. Maximilian had been installed as a puppet of Napoleon III of France in a bid to expand France's imperial power. When news of his assassination, along with 2 of his generals, reached France in early July, Manet, a committed Republican who opposed Napoleon III's autocratic regime, was galvanized into action despite his professed disdain of history painting. In the words of Manet's childhood friend, quote, "to his mind, history painter was the nastiest insult you could throw at an artist." And Manet soon began the first of 3 painted responses. Manet's composition, Victims on the left and Firing Squad on the right, with little space between them, reveals his debt to Goya, as has been widely acknowledged. Also recalling Goya's example, there is an immediacy to Manet's painting, the most freely brushed of the 3 versions, which suggests the rapidity of his response to the event. The composition evolved as additional news reports as well as photographs reached Paris in the ensuing months. Manet's 2 subsequent paintings of this subject retain the overall compositional structure of this, the first. He began this second version in fall 1867. It is marked by tighter handling and greater formal clarity of the figures, now set in a barren landscape evocative of the hillside where the executions took place. For this version, members of an infantry platoon posed in Manet's studio for the firing squad, and 2 of his friends modeled for the 2 generals. He later changed their heads once photographs came in of Maximilian and his 2 generals. In this version, the uniforms worn by the members of the firing squad more closely resemble those of their French counterparts, reflecting Manet's assimilation of later newspaper accounts and photographs of the event. This change also serves to implicate the French government in the death of Maximilian and his generals. In the words of Manet's friend, the writer Émile Zola, quote, "France shooting Maximilian." Although advertised as Manet's submission to the Paris Salon of 1868, the painting was never exhibited. And sadly, it appears to have been rolled up and suffered damage. Also, two of the figures on the left, one of them being Maximilian and the other general, were cut, we know, by 1883. And what then remained of the canvas was cut into 4 fragments as the work is preserved today. And by the way, we have the artist Edgar Degas to thank for its preservation, because he made it his point to reassemble the known fragments, which Manet's stepson, or maybe son, Leon Leonov, was trying to sell off the individual fragments, which Degas didn't want to happen. Manet painted the final large canvas in 1868-69. His sustained engagement with this subject from the summer of 1867 to early 1869 demonstrates its importance to him. That Manet's representation of the execution of Maximilian was seen as too politically charged is attested by the fate of the lithograph he made of the subject in 1868. The imperial censors refused to allow it to be printed or published, which prompted Manet's comment to Zola, quote, "It speaks well for the work, since there's no caption of any kind underneath it." And in fact, the lithographer threatened to destroy this stone, the lithographic stone, but luckily that was preserved so that the lithograph could ultimately be published, but not until 1884, 1 year after Manet died, while Manet's final painting remained in his studio until his death, apart from a brief absence in 1879-80 when it was sent on tour in the United States, but unfortunately it was not a blockbuster exhibition, so little comment. Goya and his paintings acquired new relevance with the onset of the Spanish Civil War in 1936. In the fight to save the Spanish Republic from Franco and fascism, Goya was extolled as the model of the socially engaged artist, the people's painter. His paintings, recognized as belonging to Spain's cultural heritage, were reproduced in newspapers, on posters, and as postcards. As the Civil War raged on, there were calls for, quote, "a new Goya still unknown." On April 26, 1937, German planes bombarded the historic Basque town of Guernica and machine-gunned civilians who were fleeing from the bombs. Many of the 1,600 civilians wounded or killed were women and children. Pablo Picasso, then living in self-imposed exile in Paris, almost certainly read a translation of the well-known newspaper account by the London Times correspondent George Steer, which was first published in France 3 days after the bombing. Steer wrote, "In the form of its execution and the scale of the destruction it wrought, no less than in the selection of its objective, the raid in Guernica is unparalleled in military history. Guernica was not a military objective. The object of the bombardment was seemingly the demoralization of the civil population and the destruction of the cradle of the Basque race." Again, this was written in 1937. Picasso had recently begun work on the commission for the Spanish Pavilion of the Universal Exposition opening in Paris in July. Just days after the bombing that shocked the world, Picasso changed course and realized the first preparatory studies for the work that he would exhibit in the Spanish Pavilion. 5 weeks later, on June 4th, 1937, Picasso completed Guernica. A compositional study dated May 9th reveals key elements of the final work already present, notably the mothers who bookend the composition, the one on the left grieving a dead child, and the one on the right running from the flames, carrying her child. And also, you can see a figure of a woman in a window who's holding out a torch. In addition, you see the bull at the left, and beneath the bull, a wounded horse on the ground below the wheel. It has been suggested that this study was informed by specific news reports and photographs from this time that showed women and other victims and the town in flames. And the day of the bombing had been a market day, so hence the women and children out, but also even the wheel, like of a cart, and also the horse and bull. 2 days after that study, Picasso was at work on the final canvas, which measures some 11 by 25 feet. Its evolution in Picasso's Paris studio is documented in a series of photographs taken over the course of May and June by Dora Maar, the surrealist photographer who became the artist, model, and lover. This is the first and only dated photograph from May 11. Here, the forms and the outline composition acquire greater clarity than the sketch that had been made just 2 days earlier. Subsequent photographs taken by Maar reveal Picasso's brief flirtation with collage and color, which he ultimately abandoned, as the final canvas would be realized in monochrome, just black, gray, and white. By June 4th, Picasso had finished the painting, and the following month it was on view in the Spanish pavilion at the Universal Exposition in Paris. And by the way, there was also a German pavilion and a Russian pavilion at the same time. In an address marking the opening of the Spanish pavilion, Picasso's use of abstraction in representing, quote, the tragedy of Guernica was defended, reflecting concern that his work somehow needed to be defended because it would not be widely understood. And here's a quote from that address. Quote, the speaker said, "I am certain that with a little goodwill, everybody will perceive the rage, the desperation, and the terrible protest that this canvas signifies," adding, "If the picture by Picasso has any defect, it is that it is too real, too terribly true, atrociously true." The pavilion's architect recalled visitors standing silently before Picasso's work. And Picasso's friend, the Spanish poet and critic José Bergamin, was among those who likened Picasso to Goya. Quote, "In linking these two names, no formal relationship is intended. Between these two styles of painting, there is no similar motif or direct aesthetic, pictorial equivalence. If we mention them together now, it is because their work reflects the same original shock. It is not painting, but history repeated on these canvases." Once the exhibition in Paris closed, Guernica was sent abroad because Picasso did not want it going back to Franco's Spain. In 1941, a young Andy Warhol saw the work in Pittsburgh. Over the ensuing decades, Picasso's history painting transcended the specificity of the event that inspired it. Guernica stands as a timeless and universal indictment of war and its horrors. In November 1963, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and the events of the following days transfixed millions of television viewers around the world. It was the first time that a national disaster had unfolded on a global scale in the age of television. Andy Warhol commented, quote, "What bothered me was the way the television and radio were programming everybody to feel so sad. It seemed like no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't get away from the thing." For Warhol, Kennedy's widow became the embodiment of this historic event. Culling from the coverage in newspapers and the pages of Life magazine, Warhol distilled this national tragedy into 8 photographs of Jacqueline Kennedy before and after her husband's assassination. And here, those are the final 8 photographs that over the course of 1964, these now iconic photographs and their mirror images, variously combined, became the basis for more than 300 known works in the artist Jackie's series. And just to give you a sense of the combinations and permutations, this one, which is the Whitney, the Met's 9 Jackies, all the same image, images with variations, and again, a single image. In its fusion of portraiture and history painting, Warhol's Jackie series recalls David's Marat at his last breath. In its own way, each work reads as a secular icon. It has also been suggested that Warhol's Jackies were his response to Picasso's Weeping Woman, a recurrent motif that first appeared in Guernica. And here you can see a detail of the figure the grieving mother at far left in Guernica, and you can see the tears that Picasso depicts. The year before Warhol created his Jackie series, Guernica was the centerpiece of a Picasso retrospective at MoMA that coincided with the artist's 80th birthday. Its weeping women embody the grief and suffering of war, while Warhol's Jackies symbolize the grief of a nation. Today we saw a radical break from tradition as artists embraced the present in history painting. Their responses to contemporary events range from overt propaganda and myth-making to political protest. The work spanned war and revolution in 18th-century Europe and North America to the global rise of mass media in the 20th century. In my final talk in the series on June 28th, we will explore how contemporary artists have both reframed existing narratives and engaged with new ones so that history painting remains relevant and resonant in the 21st century. Thank you very much. Thank you.